Hey folks, it's time to strap in for some swift suffering, since today I'm going to be talking about more 8-bit's brutal hack and slash, Bleak Sword, DX. In essence, this expands upon the initial Apple Arcade release, providing a remixed and extended campaign to cleave through. That said, was I quick to pick up this bit of swordplay, or did it wind up being a deluxe disappointment? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. In just one night, the kingdom fell. The royal family struck down by one of their own. And yet, this was not a brutal act of ambitious politics. Rather, it was caused by the corrupting influence of a dark relic known as the Bleak Sword, which poisoned and ultimately possessed its wielder. And that was just the start. Granted unnatural longevity by the blade itself, the Bleak King was provided centuries to enact his reign, plunging the countryside into chaos as dark magic spread freely and countless horrific creatures emerged from their slumber. A seemingly endless nightmare, were it not for the curious dream a lone wanderer receives. 3 magic stones scattered across the countryside, which, when united, might be able to overcome the fell magic. As for the execution, the game's intro does most of the heavy lifting, as it introduces both the backstory and premise. Yes, there are some brief scenes to accompany every boss fight, as well as to showcase your journey forward, but the real meat of the narrative comes in this moment and the finale by all accounts. Almost. See, once you clear the central story, there are a trio of epilogue areas, which actually receive a bit more exposition than their peers insofar as explaining the context for the final leg of your journey. Even still, it's overall a fairly straightforward affair, which leans more towards providing cinematic moments and establishing a mood than trying to engross players in a complicated plot. And this focus on simplicity is equally reflected in how this hack and slash plays. The controls are simple enough, being a basic combo, a charge attack, a parry, and a dodge roll. Yes, there is a stamina meter to manage, which imposes some slight degree of tactical consideration, but even that isn't too bad given it's wholly divorced from your dodges as well as your ability to parry and counter. I mean, yes, getting the timing on counters can be a bit tricky at first, but short of the stupid spiders, just about every other enemy in the game is well telegraphed on this front, and if they can't be countered, their animations still let you know when to dodge. What's more, Bleak Sword's approach to stage design really helps to make the experience feel snappy. See, each level is essentially an arena, which tasks you with clearing out the enemies which crop up, ideally in a timely fashion, given certain stages seek to overwhelm you with enemy spawns. That said, even with this basic premise, I remain solidly engaged. Part of this is simply due to the diversity of each of the game's biomes. In total, there's 12, with 11 of them having 12 stages of their own, and one with only 6, but a different style of gameplay. Each of these regions have their own pools of enemies and suitably dramatic boss encounters, providing you some interesting enemy types to learn the nuances of, as well as environmental hazards to adapt to. And even without those, there's still amount of attention provided to the stages themselves, as pillars, trees, or even narrow hallways all serve to change how you'll be forced to adapt to incoming enemies. But the element which really served to hook me the most was the overall snappy pacing of Bleak Sword as a whole. Each of these stages are relatively quick to clear on their own, making this a very good game for people who want something to pick up and play briefly, but also providing enough variety to motivate a player to barrel through its content over the course of an afternoon or two. I mean, yes, there is a certain brutality to the game that can slow your roll, but likewise there are some elements that can facilitate the journey, namely items and leveling. Items are straightforward enough. When you clear a stage, you'll occasionally receive an item, such as a consumable healing item or an accessory that boosts your attack and or defense. I mean, there's also scrolls that permanently boost a stat, though these are incredibly rare. Only the slight problem here is you have 2 item slots, which means optimizing your loadout is a logistics decision, especially with early accessories that might provide more attack, but drop your defense. Leveling, likewise, is another straightforward element. Gain enough experience, and you're given a choice to increase either your attack or defense, alternating every level. I mean, you can boost your health, but well, attack helps a lot with keeping combat quick and snappy, and if you stack enough defense, it's definitely a lot nicer than health, especially since I was never using healing items. Admittedly, these systems aren't actually safe from the game's overarching difficulty either. See, when you clear a stage, you don't actually heal back all your health, only a portion of it, which is part of why extra defense was really nice for me. And it's also made especially important since if you bleed out all of your health, all the experience you've earned towards your next level, and your items drop when you die. Which is especially important since when you inevitably bleed out, all the experience you've earned towards your next level and all of the items you've accumulated as so far will drop in the stage you died in. While you do regain it all if you clear the stage that killed you, you only get one shot to do so, which is a bit rough given that clearing a stage that killed you when you've lost all the boosts from your equipment can be a bit tricky. There were more than a few instances where I got wrecked and then proceeded to double back to earlier areas just to farm up a brand new loadout of equipment. In any case, as much as this provided a lot of content for me to pore over and master, given that I collected the majority of the achievements related to clearing bosses without being hit, that isn't actually the full extent of the game. Once you've cleared it, you unlock a brutally hard extra difficulty and 2 additional game modes, namely a boss rush that pits you against every boss in the game back to back, without items, leveling boosts, or even healing when you finish a level. That and the arena. The arena starts out a lot more forgiving than the boss rush, but even its difficulty scales up considerably, as it won't be long until you're facing off against foes from the final biomes, all while your gear and level remains the same. It's a time, but it definitely provides more content for those seeking a challenge, and you do actually heal between fights, so it's not that bad. But that's the gameplay in a nutshell, so let's move on to the graphics, and on the whole, I appreciated this quite a bit. Visually speaking, there's a lo-fi quality to the entire thing, but it still manages to provide decently detailed stages to navigate, which managed to lean into the dark ambience the game is trying to evoke. In fact, I was surprised at how dramatic the boss intros could be, despite the more simplistic visual presentation. Also, the fact that each stage is stylized like a diorama was definitely a unique element, as was the manner in which certain elements of the stage provided an obstacle both as a physical impediment, but also a potentially obscuring element that might allow an enemy to surreptitiously advance. It really coaxed me into playing more cautiously and making use of the terrain to my advantage when I wasn't necessarily sure what direction an enemy was going to come from. I also appreciated the weather effects because it was interesting to navigate the haze of a snowstorm or a sudden flash of lightning briefly interfering with my ability to track where enemies were. The latter element does represent a hazard to epileptics, which is why there's a warning there, but there is a handy accessibility option that allows you to tune down lightning strength. That said, what really brings the thunder here is the soundtrack. If you've played Super Brothers Sword and Sorcery or below, or just saw my review for Sword and Sorcery, the music might sound familiar to you since the OST was done by Jim Guthries, and it is just delightful, to the point that listening to more of the tunes was another major factor in my desire to just sit down and crush stage after stage. But yeah, all in all, this was my experience with Bleak Sword DX. Well, beyond the fact that I highly recommend using a controller. Yes, you can remap the keyboard controls and even include the mouse, but it wasn't my tool of choice here. That detail aside, I overall had a lot of fun. While simple, the overall story was enjoyable to engage with and witness, and there were some neat details to be found in the game's bestiary. That said, the real star of the show here was the gameplay. It's a solid, challenging experience, and I was surprised at the sheer amount of variety that it provided. What's more, if you were like me and stacked your offense to the high heavens, the arena provides a very solid avenue for you to see the full repertoire of your enemies' arsenals, because they are more than one-trick ponies, a fact that kept me on my toes the entire time. Which is a lot of words to say, I recommend this game enough to call it a very solid hit. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. There's also a link to my Patreon if you want to see reviews early or just want to support the channel. And to my merch house for neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.